In the 1980s, two unsuspecting travellers backpacking their way through Europe find themselves stranded on the misty, desolate moors of North England. A sinister warning from some not-so-friendly locals echoes in their ears: beware the moon. In the darkness, a menacing growl fills their ears, but there is nothing to be seen except a few harmless fluffy sheep. With a lurking, unseen creature, hidden by fog and muffled by thunder, these travellers are unaware they will soon come face to face with a terror they never imagined. One which will pass on a curse that will follow them straight into the heart of London. Today on Macabre London, we're going behind the scenes of one of horror's greatest werewolf tales to uncover a dark piece of London's cinematic history that brings out the chills and thrills like no other. It's time to explore the history of An American Werewolf in London. And welcome back to another episode of Macabre London. I'm Nikki Druce, your host with a silent G, and today I'll be taking you on a journey down another of London's grimy backstreets to uncover a macabre tale from the city's past. Today we're going to be exploring some more of London's horror movie history and settling down with our popcorn and a tango ice blast and firing up the old projector to head behind the scenes on some of your favourite London horror movies. And today we'll have you howling at the moon with an exploration into one of the genre's certified greats. However, before we get into today's story, if you're new here and you want to see more videos where we deep dive into some lesser known historic tales from London and in fact all over the world, then please don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a new episode. Also, if you like the show and you have done for a while now, then why not consider becoming a patron? You get your very own podcast feed filled with bonus episodes of my other show, Having a Problem, which is a lot of silly historical fun, and an unconscious candid look at mine and my beloved fiance's lives, and I just know you're going to love it. So if that sounds like something you'd enjoy, then the link is in the description, or just go to patreon.com/Macabre London, so I can continue to regale you with the haunted history we both love, and a little bit extra too. London has been the backdrop for many a cinematic masterpiece in its time, but equally it's also had its fair share of box office flops grace its streets. The city lends itself as a vital character in many of these films, and for some writers and directors it's been the inspiration to create a movie in the first place. Last year for Halloween, we covered the films Deathline, Creep, and one of my personal favourite films of all time, 28 Days Later, and gave a few nods to the production house of Hammer Horror, who pretty much had a residency within Highgate Cemetery for the whole of the 1970s. But that was only the very tip of the iceberg for the London horror scene. And a few of you last time let me know I'd missed out your favourite film, but don't worry, it was always on the list, but I couldn't fit two heavy hitters into one episode last time, and I'm afraid 28 Days Later pipped this one to the post. But today I'm redeeming myself and giving you what you want, a whole episode dedicated to An American Werewolf in London. Now, because I'm not great at hiding my feelings, I'm just going to go out and say it straight off the bat. I'm not a huge lover of this film. I know, hate me all you want, but I won't completely berate it the whole time. I'm just going to put my 2 pennies in here and say it's like the curate's egg for me. It's good in parts. But in my personal opinion, the reason I'm not so keen on this film is because the only woman in it is basically written in just for the purposes of an extensive sex scene. And in terms of it passing the Bechdale test, it's a big fat flop. In case you don't know about the Bechdale test, it's whether a film has more than one named female character, which technically this one does, just about, and if those characters have an independent conversation in the script, which isn't about a man, and it's a big fat nope on that count. I personally feel like they wasted the wonderful Jenny Agutter in this role, and a pioneering feminist movie this is not. But if they completely cut that character out or gave her any input into the film rather than just being eye candy, then I'd probably like it, but I'd just like a little bit more in terms of representation. But I guess this was the 80s after all. Jenny Agutter did nearly turn the role down, but she has said that she's glad she didn't, so I guess if she's happy with her part in it, then that's something, but I find it all a bit too underwhelming. However, there are some incredible pieces of cinema which I love in this film, mainly when it comes to the special effects. And the more I began learning as I researched this episode, the more I thought I'll probably give this one a rewatch with a different perspective and see if I enjoy it any more now I know a little bit more about it. Okay, so with my personal opinions out of the way, let's have a look at some of the strange things that surrounded production and how an American comedy director came to shoot an iconic horror movie in London. And as always, if you haven't seen this film and you don't want spoilers, then this is not the episode for you because there will be plenty of them. So first off, let's have a little reminder of the plot for An American Werewolf in London. So we start off with two backpacking Americans, David, played by David Norton, and Jack, played by Griffin Dunne, who find themselves in the wilds of North England as part of a 3-month cheap trip around Europe. With plentiful warnings from the locals to stay away from the moors, and after a less than welcoming trip to an isolated pub, the Slaughtered Lamb, the two are given the heave-ho and sent on their way before being told once more to stay away from the open scrubland and also beware the moon. Of course, the two don't listen, and off they go, out onto the moors after getting disorientated by fog and thunderstorms. However, hidden in the sounds of the storm are also the growls of a beast, one which is seemingly stalking them, but which cannot be seen. When David takes a tumble, the beast appears from nowhere, a huge wolf which viciously attacks Jack. David flees the scene, but then returns, but it's too late. Jack is dead, mauled beyond recognition. As he realises his friend is no more, David is swiped across the face by the werewolf, but before they have an opportunity to kill David, gunshots ring out and the beast is deceased. As David lies on the floor bleeding, he turns to see what was once a huge snarling werewolf, now becoming a normal man, lying next to him. So, to cut a long story short, David is sent to hospital in London. Why this is the case is never revealed, but we can assume it's because of American geography and not realising that the north of England is in fact about 5 or 6 hours away from London, depending on how far up the country they were originally. But that's where David finds himself, and for the next 3 weeks he's in recovery, and this is where his nurse, Alex, played by Jenny Agutter, is introduced as she falls in love with him during this time and whilst he's passed out. Whilst in recovery, David is plagued with monstrous visions of the undead, one of which happens to be Jack himself, and he becomes the invisible sidekick for the rest of the film, filling him in on the details of what happened that night and how he has been infected by werewolf DNA. As David suffers horrendous nightmares, one of which features Nazi zombies attacking Alex, he becomes increasingly paranoid, and the visions of an undead Jack does nothing to help this. As he's getting better, David is released from hospital, but he's still in recovery. But as he has nowhere to stay, Alex says he can crash at her place. She's wary, as David at this point has actually told her he's a werewolf, and even though she doesn't know him, she lets him stay anyway. And despite David being in active recovery from his injuries, they become romantically involved pretty much straight away. All the while this is going on, the doctor that was in charge of David's recovery at the hospital, Dr. Hirsch, makes his way to the pub the backpackers began at in the north, the Slaughtered Lamb, and after doing some digging at the pub with the locals, he discovered that, as he may have suspected, David has been in contact with something supernatural. Back at Nurse Alex's flat, she heads off to work and leaves David on his own to while away the hours. As the day draws in, the moon rises, and it's here we finally receive one of the greatest special effects moments in cinematic history. The pioneering transformation scene, which went on to win an Oscar, shows David turning into a werewolf in all its agonising glory. Skin is stretched taut over bone, fangs jut painfully out of our protagonist's mouth, and hair sprouts all over his body. The agony the change makes on his form is palpable to the viewer, and it's an astonishing watch. As soon as he's fully transformed, David, now a huge lumbering werewolf, dashes out of Alex's flat and escapes into London, where he takes down no less than 6 victims in a variety of different recognisable locations. Having been on a murderous rampage, David goes to London Zoo, where the following morning he wakes up back in his human form, but is now naked. Hilarity then ensues as he has to find any clothing which will work before managing to make it back home to Alex, who is anxiously awaiting his return. When he arrives back at the flat, Alex is worried but happy to see David is okay, and so she calls Dr. Hirsch, who had informed her of the potential werewolf bother she may be in for the day before. Realising he needs medical help, and with Dr. Hirsch eager to get David somewhere safe, Alex convinces him to get in a cab where they can go to St. Martin's Hospital. On the way there, the radio spoils things as the host announces 6 murders that happened across the capital the previous evening. David realises this must have been him, freaks out, and escapes the cab. After finding him, David tells Alex that he can't see her anymore as he's frightened of what he may do, and so the pair part ways. David then thinks about suicide after calling home from a payphone to tell his family he loves them, and he considers going through with it to end the curse, but he can't do it. Undead Jack makes another appearance across the street from the payphone and beckons David into an adults-only movie theatre, and he follows. In there, David is confronted with the ghosts of his 6 victims from the night before, with each of them offering helpful solutions to his current predicament. But unbeknownst to the people inside, the moon is rising outside, and as it reaches its highest point in the sky, David once more undergoes his painful transformation into a werewolf. After doing so, he annihilates the rest of the patrons in the movie theatre, and the police are called. Chaos erupts on the streets as the werewolf rampages around Piccadilly Circus, and in the end, Dr. Hirsch and Alex arrive. Alex tearfully lures David down an alleyway where the police have rifles pointed, and they open fire, killing the wolf, who then, as he dies, turns back into David, lying on the cold floor. The end. So with that basic plot outline covered, let's go into some of the details which make this an interesting piece of London's history. Now, let's start off with how this film even managed to get greenlit in the first place. Well, strangely, the director, John Landis, had written the film 20 years earlier in the 60s, but it hadn't had the chance to see the light of day until he found success in a different direction. After directing the comedy films Animal House and The Blues Brothers, and both of those being incredibly well received, studio execs figured that Landis's werewolf movie could be a hit of equal measure. But when it came to its release, audiences were confused when it made its way onto the big screen in 1981, as they were expecting a horror comedy instead of something quite gory and terrifying. This confused the initial reception, but it landed well, and it smashed its box office targets and has gone on to gross over $62 million in revenue since its initial release. But things didn't go so smoothly during the creation of the film. Firstly, before the film even began production, there were arguments between studio execs as to who should play the roles. As The Blues Brothers had been a huge hit, the studio execs wanted the original duo, John Belushi and Dan Aykroyd, to play David and Jack. However, Landis didn't think the casting would work as firstly they were too old and they were 2 comedy actors, and instead he went for 2 relatively unknown actors in the form of David and Griffin. But in reality, both men were playing college-age kids, but Griffin was 26 and David was 30. When you know the age they were meant to be playing, this makes this relationship between Nurse Alex and David a bit weird, as she was seemingly considerably older than him, but that seems like just one of the film's many oversights. Landis had originally wanted acclaimed actor Donald Sutherland to play David's role, but they couldn't make it work, and the studio wasn't keen, so instead Landis picked a guy he'd seen on a Dr. Pepper advert. This long-term work, which David had been doing for the soda company, was terminated after he appeared naked in the film and his contract came to a close. And speaking of beverages, the patrons seen drinking in the pub at the beginning of the film were chosen for obvious reasons. The group in the pub were actually the members of the Royal Shakespeare Company, one of which is a very young Rick Mayall, as in Drop Dead Fred or Rick from the Young Ones. But acting prestige aside, the biggest standout moment in this film is the infamous transformation scene. In a time before CGI, the whole thing had to be made using exclusively practical effects. Rick Baker, the special effects artist behind the transformation, won the first ever Academy Award for Best Makeup for his work on the film. In fact, before this film, Baker had created the iconic makeup for Reagan in The Exorcist, but up until this point, there had never been an Oscar dedicated to just that. But given his contributions to creating some of the most iconic horror movie characters ever, the award was created with pretty much the idea in mind that he would be winning it a lot. And he did just that, racking up 7 Oscars over his decades-long career. One of the reasons why director John Landis had waited a long time to get his film into production wasn't just because of the studios. It was also because he wanted An American Werewolf in London to feature the most realistic transformation scene ever to be put on film. He wanted it to be shot with minimal cuts and the visceral nature of the change to be captured in all its horrifying glory. And so, Landis had to wait until technology and effects had advanced enough to do justice to his vision. Baker and Landis worked tirelessly with a combination of prosthetics, animatronics, and painstakingly crafted makeup, all designed to convey the painful metamorphosis of David Norton's character into a werewolf. And what came out on screen is something that is both horrifying and delightful in equal measures. The scene took over a week to shoot, with each shot meticulously planned to show each stage of the transformation, including elongating limbs and a painfully distorted face to emphasise the suffering involved. David Norton himself spent hours in the makeup chair each day, with each step of the transformation sequence filmed separately to allow for extensive prosthetics and makeup adjustments between shots. And to be honest, they could have probably just released this scene in the film on its own, and it would have still done alright in the box office, as nothing like this had ever been seen before. The success of this scene alone set a high bar for practical effects and inspired countless filmmakers to explore realistic, on-camera effects for creature transformations, which led to a boom in big practical effects movies after this, and whether they realised it or not, they were all going to be heavily inspired by the werewolf transformation scene in An American Werewolf in London. Now, interestingly, Landis managed to get such an iconic location in London to shoot the film's final climax as a result of wooing the police. To make sure the Bobbies turned a blind eye to the huge operation needed to close down Piccadilly Circus, Landis hired a whole cinema and put on a free screening of the Blues Brothers and invited 300 of the Met to come along. This generous act made sure the police didn't hinder the filming in Piccadilly Circus, and it meant that An American Werewolf in London was the first film to be shot there in 15 years. A few other productions did shoot here in the subsequent years, but it wasn't loved by the police, and perhaps the crews were not as generous. But when Danny Boyle was shooting 28 days later, he managed to convince the local authorities, as the window of shooting was so brief, capping it at only 10 to 15 minutes for each shot. Due to their scaled-down equipment and lack of extras, and shooting exclusively on handheld digital cameras, the police agreed to it. Anyway, back to the film in hand. The fact that David turns into a wolf on 2 consecutive nights is a bit of an error, as technically there is only one ever true full moon in a lunar cycle. But in order to make the film end, I guess this had to happen, rather than waiting a full month for David to transform once more. Despite being a film written and directed by an American, the inclusion of British actors and crew meant that the film became a dark horror comedy hit with both audiences, and has stayed at the top of many people's Halloween must-watch lists for a number of decades, over 40 years in fact, and it really did change the game. Now, even though it's not my own personal favourite, in a weird way I still rate it, even if only for the SFX alone. This film has a certain charm, a tongue-in-cheek humour, which is a theme throughout Landis's back catalogue, and for its foibles, it did help studios to take horror as an artistic medium seriously, paving the way for many other genre movies to appear afterwards in the hopes they could recreate even a little of its box office success, even if some of those movies were complete rubbish. An American Werewolf in London is a film that takes horror fans on a uniquely disturbing journey through London and manages to effortlessly blend dark humour with genuine terrifying horror in a way that still feels fresh even to this day. And even though the film has its fair share of quirks and arguably some controversies, there's no denying its long-lasting impact on cinema. And for that, it's definitely earned a place as part of London's howling horror movie history. Thanks for joining me for this episode. As always, I'd love to know your thoughts on this one and tell me if any of this info is new to you or what facts you picked up from today's episode. Do please pop them in the YouTube comments or on my social media. You can find me at Nikki Macabre London on Instagram and at Macabre London on Twitter and TikTok. So if you want to support me to help make these episodes even better and to contribute to my much needed coffee bill and to get extra content in return, including my extra exclusive Patreon podcast, Having a Problem, then check out my Patreon at patreon.com/Macabre London. If you're listening to the podcast, head over to YouTube to see the faces and places I talk about. Just search for Macabre London Podcast and don't forget to say hi in the comments and subscribe whilst you're there. If you like this, then you're going to love my other podcast. It's called Killers, Cults and Queens, and you can find it wherever you get your podcasts or just click the link in the show notes. For the scariest, spookiest and creepiest merch known to man, visit macabrelondon-shop.fourthwall.com, which if you sign up on Patreon, you also get a nice discount on merch. And if you're watching on YouTube, the merch is just underneath the videos, so it's very easy to access. Just click on the product. A big thanks to my amazing top tier Patreon producers, Christina, Christoph, Heather's Leg, Lisa, Mary, Ravel, Sally, Sam, Sarah, Terry, Teresa and Veronica, and all of our other fantastic patrons. If you want your name read out in the episodes or listed in the show notes, join us on Patreon. I'd love to personally welcome you to the Ghoul Gang. Thanks for joining me for another macabre tale from London's past. I've been Nikki Druce. Remember to stay spooky, have a very, very happy Halloween, don't let the bed bugs bite, and I'll see you ghouls next time.